Hello everyone, I'm Jed Rubenfeld and this is a straight down the middle short take. Well, many of you may have read yesterday that the Supreme Court upheld a Trump administration executive order banning trans people from serving in the US military. Well, if you read that, that's not exactly right. First of all, the Supreme Court didn't uphold anything. It issued a completely procedural order, not in the merits, and I'll explain that to you in a minute. But second, the Trump executive order does not exactly ban trans people from serving in the military. It comes pretty close, but it differs in its language in an important way that could have very significant legal consequences. Okay, so what in fact does the executive order say? What did the Supreme Court actually do? And what happens next in the case? Let's jump right in. Well, back in January, Trump issued an executive order disqualifying certain people from serving in the US military, and that's become known as the trans ban. But the order doesn't exactly say that trans people can't serve in the US military. Who does it say can't serve in the US military? People with gender dysphoria. Well, what the heck is that? Gender dysphoria is a psychiatric disorder, a mental illness recognized by the psychiatric profession and the medical profession. It's included in the DSM-5, the so-called Bible of the psychiatric profession. It's defined as, I'm not going to use all the jargon that's often used here, but it's basically defined as significant distress or impairment caused by a perceived conflict between a person's biological sex and the sex that they think they are, or want to be, or want to present to the world. Okay, so that's a psychiatric illness or disorder recognized by the medical and psychiatric professions. Why is it important that the order uses that term? Well, the order is kind of cleverly drafted that way, and let me tell you why. What it does is it gives the Trump administration a couple of arguments in favor of the executive order that it wouldn't have otherwise. What are those arguments? Well, first, it turns out that the military has been banning for decades folks from serving in any of the armed forces if they have any number of psychiatric disorders recognized by the DSM and by the medical profession. And I'm talking about a whole lot of different disorders. You've got depressive disorder, anxiety disorder, social phobia, simple phobia, obsessive compulsive disorders. There's all kinds of disorders that, according to current Department of Defense regulations, make you ineligible to serve in the US military. So nobody's ever thought that those regulations are unconstitutional, even though they cut pretty broadly, and psychiatrists will tell you that those kinds of diagnoses are a little bit subjective and tricky, but nobody's ever thought that there was anything unconstitutional about the military saying, hey, people with these psychiatric disorders just can't serve in the military, or even with a history of these disorders can't serve in the military. So from that point of view, the executive order isn't so different from lots of other regulations that already exist. Now, what's a second reason? Second reason is a little more complicated, has more to do with constitutional law. So let's say that you are a lawyer trying to knock down this executive order. You're pro-trans, you're trying to get rid of the executive order. What are you going to argue? Well, here's one of the big arguments you're going to make. You're going to say that this executive order, it's sex discrimination. That's right, it discriminates on the basis of sex. Now, why would you want to say that? Well, if you can show that a measure classifies or discriminates on the basis of sex, well, that triggers something called heightened scrutiny under equal protection jurisprudence. Heightened scrutiny doesn't necessarily mean that a measure is going to be struck down, but it makes it much more likely. And if you can show that a measure classifies people on the basis of their sex or discriminates on the basis of sex, that triggers heightened scrutiny. Now, if you're a lawyer arguing against this executive order, you're pro-trans, trying to get rid of the ban, you're going to point to a decision made by the Supreme Court a few years ago called Bostock. This is a 6-3 decision by the Supreme Court saying that private employers can't discriminate against trans people. And in the majority opinion written by Justice Gorsuch, the court says, anytime you discriminate against people on the basis of their transgender status, that is a discrimination on the basis of sex. Now, a lot of people disagree with that statement by Justice Gorsuch. Some people agree with it. Some people say, well, that case, Bostock, that's a Title VII case. That's not applicable to a constitutional case anyway. But nevertheless, it's a very clear categorical holding. Anytime you discriminate on the basis of trans status, you're discriminating on the basis of sex, and that's exactly what the lawyers, the pro-trans lawyers trying to get rid of this ban, are arguing in the district courts. And guess what? A district court out in Washington, and actually a couple other district courts elsewhere in the country, accepted that argument. Said, yeah, this is a discrimination on the basis of sex under Bostock, and that triggers heightened scrutiny. And under heightened scrutiny, this executive order fails, and it's unconstitutional. And on that basis, this district court out in Washington issued an injunction and said, nope, can't enforce this. I'm issuing an injunction against this executive order. Now, if you're the government, you're trying to defend this executive order, what do you say in response? Well, what you say is, hang on, our executive order, it does not classify or discriminate on the basis of trans status. It just discriminates on the basis of whether or classifies on the basis of whether a person has gender dysphoria. That's not sex classifying, that's not sex discrimination, the lawyers for the government will say. It applies equally, identically to everybody of all genders, male or female. It applies identically. If you have gender dysphoria, you can't serve. It doesn't matter whether you're a man or a woman. It has nothing to do with classifying on the basis of sex. So that's what you say if you're the government. Now, what did the Supreme Court say when it got this case? What did it actually say about that in its ruling from a couple of days ago? Nothing. It didn't reach the merits, as I said before. In fact, there was no opinion at all. So what was the Supreme Court case doing? What did the Supreme Court do? Well, to understand that, you got to step back again to the district court out in Washington. District court issues this injunction, a nationwide injunction, by the way. If you want to hear more about nationwide injunctions, I've got another episode on that. You can tune into that one. But this district court out in Washington State issues this nationwide injunction against the trans ban, so-called trans ban. And the government runs the Ninth Circuit. And they say, wait a minute, you got to stay this injunction. What does it mean to stay an injunction? Just mean, don't let the injunction go into effect. Let us go ahead and apply and implement the executive order while the case is fully briefed and you hear the case on the merits. And Ninth Circuit, when you decide on the merits, then you can reinstate the injunction or strike it down. But just for now, just don't let it go into effect. Stay the injunction. Well, the Ninth Circuit refused. Said, no, we're not staying the injunction. The injunction remains in effect. You can submit your briefs. We'll consider the case on the merits, but for now, the injunction stays in effect. Well, at that point, lawyers for the government, they ran to the Supreme Court. They filed an emergency application. This is part of the Supreme Court's so-called shadow docket, and I'll do another episode on the shadow docket, but that's what they did. They ran to the Supreme Court. They filed an emergency application saying, no, you got to stay this injunction. We want you to stay the injunction while the case is fully litigated. And that's what the Supreme Court did. They issued a stay. They issued a stay of the injunction. No opinion. 3 justices, however, said they would not have done it. The 3 most liberal justices, or so-called liberal justices, Justice Jackson, Justice Kagan, Justice Sotomayor. So that means the other 6 justices joined the order, the decision by the Supreme Court to stay the injunction. Is there a signal there? Well, if you want to read tea leaves, if you want to do tea leaf reading, yeah, you can say, well, that's telling us that 6 justices might be in favor of upholding the Trump executive order. But that's tea leaf reading. You can't tell. Maybe 6 justices are more inclined to uphold it. Maybe it has nothing to do with that. Maybe they don't like the fact that it was a nationwide injunction. Maybe they're just deciding, look, the case has to be fully litigated before anything gets enjoined. So what's going to happen next? Well, the case will be adjudicated on the merits. Probably the next thing that will happen is the Ninth Circuit will get the briefs on the merits and make a decision on its own, and then the case would go back up probably to the Supreme Court. No matter who wins, the other side is likely to take the appeal back to Supreme Court, which probably will eventually decide whether that executive order is constitutional or not. Now, I haven't said anything here about the regulations passed by the military to implement that executive order. They're a little different. They don't just say folks with a diagnosis of gender dysphoria can't serve. They say anybody with a history of gender dysphoria can't serve, and that could be a little different for reasons I won't go into here. But the point is, the Supreme Court did not uphold the executive order, did not strike it down, didn't do anything on the merits, just stayed the injunction issued by the lower court. So that's what's happening. Now you know the issues. That's all for now. Goodbye.